Welcome to Sleepy Beep. Let the sound of that settle over you like a blanket pulled up to the chin. There is nothing you need to do now. Nowhere else you need to be. You have arrived at the end of the day, and whatever the day asked of you, it is finished with you now. You can set it down. You can let your shoulders drop away from your ears. You can let the weight of your own head sink fully into the pillow, the way a stone settles into the soft bed of a river, unhurried, held. Tonight we are going to slow down together and spend some time with something very old. A conversation that happened almost 2,400 years ago on a small island in the middle of a warm sea between a great power and a very small town. It is a story about strength and weakness, about what people say to each other when one of them has all the power and the other has almost none. And it is a story that a man wrote down not to win a prize, not to be clapped for once and forgotten, but to last. He said so himself. He wanted to make, in his own words, a possession for all time. And here we are, all these centuries later, holding it in the dark. So in a small way, he succeeded. You do not need to know anything about ancient history to listen. You do not need to remember any names. You do not need to follow an argument or keep track of dates. If a name drifts past you and you lose it, let it go, like a leaf on water. I will explain everything gently as we go, and nothing here asks anything of you except that you rest. There is nothing to figure out tonight. There is nothing to solve. There is only a voice and an old story and the slow warm dark around you. If you feel like it, and only if it is easy, you might share in the comments what time it is where you are and where in the world you are listening from. Some of you are lying in the very early hours, long past midnight, the house quiet around you. Some of you are just closing your eyes as the evening comes down. Wherever you are on the turning earth, whatever hour it is in your corner of it, you are welcome here. Take a slow, deep breath now. In, gently, through the nose. And out, softly, letting it go. Wherever you are, let yourself settle in. Feel the surface beneath you taking your full weight. Feel how little you actually have to hold up right now. Almost nothing. The bed holds you. The dark holds you. You can let it. Thank you for joining us here at Sleepy Beep. Let us begin. I want to start not at the beginning of this story, but at a strange place near its end, because it will change how you hear everything that comes after. There was a great city, the greatest and most powerful city of its world, and it went to a small island and made that island an example. The city won. It won completely. It won the argument, and then it won the war that followed the argument, and it did to that little island exactly what it said it would do. The strong got their way, and if the story stopped there, you would nod and feel a little cold and think, well, that is how the world works. The powerful do as they please. It has always been so. But the man who wrote this story did something quiet and devastating. He placed, on the very next pages, what happened to that great and powerful city just 2 years later. Because that same city, so sure of itself, so certain that strength was a thing it simply owned, went sailing off on another adventure, this time against a city far away across the sea. And there, everything went wrong. The great power was defeated, utterly, its enormous army broken, and the survivors, thousands of them, were marched into deep pits of cutstone, quarries carved into the earth, and left there. Worked, starved, crowded together under the open sky and the hard sun, in the very kind of place where the powerless go to be forgotten. The city that had told a small island, "You are weak, and the weak must suffer," became, within 2 years, the weak suffering. Hold that for a moment. Let it sit in the quiet with you. The winner became the loser, the strong became the weak, and the man who wrote it down arranged the pages so that you could not miss it, if you were paying attention. That is the first thing I want you to carry into sleep tonight, not a lesson you have to work at. Just an image, a great power, sure of itself, and then, a short while later, the same power sitting in a stone pit, learning what its own victims had known. The wheel that turns. We will come back to it, softly, again and again. Now let me tell you about the man who wrote this, because he matters, and because his own life is part of why the story is so honest. His name was Thucydides. Say it slowly to yourself if you like, or do not bother, it does not matter. Thucydides, he was an Athenian, which is to say he belonged to Athens, the great and clever and proud city at the centre of this whole story. And here is the thing about him that most people never learn. He was not some distant scholar sitting safely in a library, judging soldiers he had never met. He had been a soldier himself. More than a soldier. He had been a general. His people had trusted him with command, with ships, with the lives of men and the safety of a city. And he failed. There was a place called Amphipolis, far to the north, a city that Athens badly wanted to keep. Thucydides was given the job of saving it. He arrived too late. An enemy commander, a clever and quick Spartan, took the city before Thucydides could reach it. And for that failure, Athens exiled him, sent him away, cast him out. The city he had served took his command, took his home, and told him not to come back. Imagine that for a moment, gently as you lie there. To have given yourself to something, to have been trusted and then to fail once, and be discarded for it. Sent away for 20 years, 20 years of exile. It is the kind of thing that could make a person bitter, or broken, or loud with grievance for the rest of their days. But something else happened to Thucydides instead. Being cast out of Athens, being no longer anyone's general, and no longer anyone's loyal citizen, he was free in a way he had never been. He could travel. He could go anywhere, including to the enemy's side, and talk to people Athens would never have let him talk to. He could listen to both sides of the war. He could stand a little outside it all, no longer a player, only a watcher. And he used those 20 years to write. The man that power had thrown away became the clearest, coldest, most honest observer of power that the world had yet produced. There is something almost tender in that, if you let yourself feel it. The one who saw power most truly was the one power had finished with. He had nothing left to protect. He could simply tell the truth. And he told us how he worked, which is a rare and honest thing. He was writing about speeches, about conversations, about what people said to one another in councils and on beaches and in besieged towns. And he admitted, plainly, that he could not always know the exact words. He was not there for all of it. No recording existed, no perfect memory. So he told his readers, in effect, this is what I have done. Where I could not know the precise words, I have written what seemed to me the kind of thing each speaker would have said, what the situation truly called for, while keeping as close as I could to the real sense of what was actually said. Sit with how honest that is. He is telling you, right at the start, do not take these speeches as a perfect transcript. They are reconstructions. They are, in a way, his careful imagining of what the truth of the moment demanded. And that is exactly why the conversation we are going to explore over these hours has lasted so long. It is not a court record, it is something closer to a laboratory. a place where Thucydides could take the raw logic of power and hold it up to the light, turn it, and let us see the mechanism working. The story is true in the way the deepest stories are true, not because every word was spoken exactly so, but because it shows you something real about how people actually behave when the difference in power between them is very great. And he said plainly why he did all this. He did not write for applause. He said he was not composing a piece to be recited once and enjoyed and set aside. He was making, as I told you, a possession for all time. He believed that human nature stays much the same, and so he thought things like this would happen again and again, in different clothes, in different centuries. And anyone who understood this one clearly would understand the next one too. He was not only describing a war, he was leaving us a mirror. That is a bold thing to attempt, and the strange fact that we are here, in the dark, listening to it now, all these ages later, means he was not wrong. So now let me set the scene, slowly, the way you might set out the pieces of something before you begin. Taking your time, letting each one settle into place. The year was 416 years before the Common Era. A warm year in a long, exhausting war. This war had a name, the Peloponnesian War, and it was the great conflict of that age, fought between Athens, the sea power, the clever restless empire, and Sparta, the land power, hard and disciplined and proud. The war had already been grinding on for many years, and everyone was tired of it. So tired that they had made a kind of peace. A truce. It was called the Peace of Nicias, named for the cautious Athenian who had helped arrange it a few years earlier. But it was a peace only in name. It was one of those pauses that is not really a pause, where the fighting slows but never quite stops, where the two great powers circle each other, testing, probing, never fully trusting, never fully at rest. You may know that feeling in a smaller way, the argument that has supposedly ended but has not really ended, the quiet in a house that is not truly peaceful, only waiting. That was the state of the world in that year. A peace that everyone knew was thin. And it was during this thin peace, this so-called truce, that Athens turned its enormous attention to a small island called Melos. Let me help you see Melos. It is a real place, a small island in the southern part of that warm sea, one of a scattered group of islands, the kind of place a modern traveller might visit now for its quiet beaches and never guess what happened there. Small, a town of a few thousand people, no more. Not a great city with high walls and a mighty fleet, just a modest island community, going about its life, fishing, farming the thin soil, worshipping its gods, minding its own small affairs on its own small rock in the sea. And to this little place, Athens sent a force that I want you to picture carefully, because the sheer size of it, against the smallness of the target, tells you almost everything. 38 ships. Warships, long and lean, their oars moving together, cutting the water. 30 of them Athenian, and the rest sent by allies who sailed under Athens's shadow. On those ships and in that expedition came around 1,600 heavily armed foot soldiers, the ones they called hoplites, men in bronze and shield and helmet, the crushing infantry of that age. And with them 300 archers and a small number of mounted archers, and then on top of all of that, something like another 1,500 fighting men drawn from Athens's allies and the islands under its power. Add it together in your mind, slowly. Thousands of trained soldiers, 38 ships riding at anchor off the shore, an armament fit to break a real city. All of it sent against a town of a few thousand souls who had done Athens no harm. That is the scene. That is the scale. A hammer, enormous and gleaming, raised over something very small. And here is the strange and important thing, the thing the ordinary telling of this story leaves out. Athens did not send all of this simply to rob Melos, or because Melos had attacked it, or because it hated the Melians. It sent this force to make a point, to send a message, not really to the Melians at all, but to everyone else who was watching, to all the other islands and cities that Athens ruled, so that they would see what happens and understand what they must never try. The little island was, in a way, a stage, and the play being performed on it was meant for a much larger audience. Keep that in the back of your mind as you drift. The strong did not come here out of simple greed. They came to be seen being strong. That, it turns out, is a far more unsettling thing than mere robbery. We will unfold why, slowly in time. Now, before we go any further, I want to gently clear away a misunderstanding, because it will make everything cleaner and truer for you. You may have heard somewhere a famous line that comes from this very episode. It is one of the most quoted sentences about power in all of history. It goes something like this: "The strong do what they can, and the weak suffer what they must." Perhaps you have heard it. It has a hard, ringing, final sound to it, like a door closing. The strong do what they can, and the weak suffer what they must. Here is something surprising, and I want you to receive it as a small gift, the kind of thing that makes you understand the whole matter a little more deeply. Thucydides never actually wrote that sentence. Not quite. Not in that clean, sharp, unforgettable shape. That famous line is a modern condensation. It is what happens when translators and readers, over the centuries, take a longer and more careful idea and polish it down, and down, and down, into a single gleaming epigram that fits on a page or in the memory. It is beautiful, it is memorable, and it is a paraphrase, a tidying up of something that was, in the original, longer and stranger, and, honestly, more troubling. Because what the Athenians actually argued was more loyally than that, more precise, more like a cold clause in a contract than a battle cry. Their real claim was this: questions of justice, they said, questions of what is fair and right, only arise between people who are equal in power. Between the strong and the weak, where the difference in power is enormous, justice simply does not enter into it. The powerful take and do what they are able to take and do, and the weak accept and endure what they have no power to refuse. Do you feel the difference? The popular version says, "The strong do what they can, and the weak suffer what they must," and it lands like a statement about cruelty, about the world being a savage place. But the real claim is quieter, and when you turn it over colder, it is not saying the strong are cruel. It is making a claim about the word fairness itself. It is saying that fairness, justice, rightness, these are things that only work, only mean anything, only have any force between parties of roughly equal strength. And where that equality is absent, the word fairness stops doing any work at all. It becomes, they are saying, an empty sound. A wish dressed up as an argument. That is a much deeper and much more disturbing idea than might makes right. We are going to spend real time with it over these hours, gently turning it in the light, because it is the true heart of what Thucydides understood. But for now, let it rest in you as a small seed. The most famous sentence about power was never quite written that way, and the real thing underneath it is stranger than the slogan. Justice, the Athenians said, is settled only between equals in power. Everywhere else, it is a word that hangs in the air and changes nothing. Let us pause here for a moment. There is no hurry. We have laid out the pieces, and now we can simply breathe with them for a little while. Take a slow, deep breath. In, softly, and out, letting it fall away. Notice the quiet in the room around you. Notice the small sounds underneath the quiet, if there are any. The hum of the house, the wind, your own breathing, going on without your having to manage it at all. Notice how the body, when you stop asking anything of it, begins on its own to soften. The jaw loosens. The hands grow heavy. The long muscles of the legs let go. You do not have to do this. It does what it does when you allow it. When you are ready, we will continue together. There is no rush. The story will wait for you in the dark. Let me stay a little longer with this man Thucydides and the strange, patient thing he was attempting. Because it is easy to hear the word history and imagine something dry, a list of dates and battles to be memorized. What he was doing was not that. Remember that he had been thrown out. Remember that his own city had trusted him, and he had failed at Amphipolis, arrived too late, lost the city to that quick Spartan commander, and been exiled for it. A lesser man might have written a book explaining why the failure was not really his fault. A bitter man might have written to settle scores, to blame, to justify himself. Thucydides did something much harder and much rarer. He set himself, as far as any human being can, to see clearly. To describe how power actually behaves, not how we wish it behaved. Not how the poets and the storytellers said it behaved, with the gods stepping in to reward the good and punish the wicked. He wanted the truth beneath the comforting stories. And he told his readers this too, right at the beginning. He said his work might, for that very reason, be a little less pleasant to listen to. Because he had deliberately stripped out the legends, the myths, the pleasing tales that make history go down easy. He wanted evidence. He wanted what people had actually seen and done. He knew that a history without the comforting old stories would be a harder, plainer thing to read, and he chose it anyway. He would rather be true and a little cold than warm and a little false. I find something almost restful in that, strange as it sounds. There is a kind of peace in a person who is not trying to flatter you, not trying to sell you a comforting version of things, but simply, patiently, telling you what is so. And notice, gently, how the form of his work mirrors its content. In the story we are going to explore, the Athenians strip away all the comforting justifications for power. They refuse to pretend. And Thucydides, the writer, does the very same thing to history itself. He strips away the comforting legends. The man and his subject rhyme. The way he wrote matches the thing he saw. So when we sit with the conversation at Melos over these next hours, hold in your mind that we are not reading a newspaper report. We are reading something a wise, disappointed, clear-eyed man built, out of the raw material of a real and terrible event, in order to show us how power works when all its costumes are removed. He reconstructed the speeches by his own honest admission, giving each side the words the moment truly demanded, staying as close as he could to what was really said. He built it to last, a possession for all time, and he built it, though he could not have known our particular faces in the dark, for us. Because here is what he believed, and it is the reason this old island story matters to you tonight, lying in your own bed in your own century, so far from that warm sea. He believed that human nature does not really change, that the same patterns, the same moves, the same collisions between the strong and the weak would repeat themselves down all the years, wearing different clothes, speaking different languages, but underneath, the same. The empire and the island, the powerful and the powerless, the one who can and the one who must. And if he was right, then this conversation is not only about two peoples on a small Greek island long ago. It is about every place where one party holds most of the power and the other holds almost none, and there is no one standing above them both to make things fair. We will find it in the hours ahead, in places you would not expect, in the quiet rooms where people work, in the deals struck between the large and the small, in families even, in the oldest and closest of human arrangements. The mechanism is the same wherever it appears. Thucydides found it first and named it clearest in this one small doomed town. But we are getting ahead of ourselves, and there is no need to rush toward the meaning. Tonight we are simply arriving. We have met the man who wrote it, the exiled general with nothing left to protect and therefore nothing left to fear, patiently making his possession for all time. We have seen the strange shape of the whole thing, the great power that wins, and then, 2 years on, sits in a stone pit, having become the weak it once crushed. We have set out the scene, the warm year of 416, the thin and dishonest peace, the 38 ships and the thousands of soldiers gathering off the shore of a town of a few thousand souls. And we have cleared away the polished slogan to find the colder, truer claim beneath it. Justice is settled only between equals in power. Everywhere else, fairness is a word without force. Let all of that lie in you now, without effort. You do not need to hold it. You do not need to remember it. If it slips away as you drift, that is exactly as it should be. The story does not need you to keep it. It has kept itself for 2,400 years, and it will keep a little longer, at least until we meet again on the far side of this pause. Because in a little while, we are going to go into the room where the great power and the small island actually spoke to one another. And it is a strange room, arranged in a strange way, for reasons that tell you a great deal about fear, and about who is allowed to hear what, and about the small, doomed cleverness of people trying to control a conversation whose ending is already decided. The Melians, the islanders, did something careful before the talking even began. They tried to choose who would be in the room. They tried to keep the powerful visitors away from the ordinary people, the crowd, the assembly, because they were afraid, and their fear was not foolish, of what a single seductive speech might do to a frightened population. They wanted the conversation to happen only in front of their leaders, their council, the few, the ones they trusted to hold the line. And we will see gently, in the hours ahead, whether that careful arrangement saved them. Whether controlling the room ever saves anyone, when the ships are already in the harbour and the soldiers are already on the shore. Whether the small moves the powerless make in the face of the overwhelming ever add up to enough, and if not always, then when and how, and what the difference is between a move that keeps you alive and a move that only feels brave. But not yet. Not tonight. This early. For now, the ships are riding at anchor in the warm, dark water off Melos. The soldiers are camped on the beach, their fires burning low. The islanders are gathered inside their walls, awake, uneasy, talking in low voices about who will speak for them and what can possibly be said. And the two sides have not yet met. The great question of the whole story, the question of what the weak can say to the strong when there is no one above either of them to make things fair, has not yet been asked out loud. It is hanging in the air, over that little island, over that warm sea, waiting for the morning. So let it wait. Let the ships rest at their anchors. Let the fires burn down to embers on the beach. There is nothing you need to decide, nothing you need to carry, nothing you need to solve before sleep. The morning in the story will come whether we hurry it or not, and we are in no hurry at all. Take one more slow deep breath now. In, gently, and out, letting everything go a little looser than before. Feel how the room has grown softer around you as we have talked. Feel how far away the day has drifted. You are here, and it is dark, and an old story is unfolding quietly beside you, asking nothing, only keeping you company while you sink toward sleep. Wherever you are, whatever hour the clock shows in your corner of the turning world, you are exactly where you need to be, which is here, resting, held. And when you are ready, we will go into the room together and hear what the great power said to the small island and how the small island answered, and begin to understand the cold and simple thing that a discarded general saw so clearly, so long ago that we are still turning it over in the dark all these centuries later. There is time. There is all the time in the world. Let us continue, softly, together. The morning comes slowly, as mornings do in old stories, not with brightness or noise, but with the particular kind of quiet that exists just before something important is said. The Athenian envoys have been on the island for some time already. Their ships are in the harbour, their men on the land, their intentions plain. They have not come to trade. They have not come with gifts or grievances or anything so human as a complaint. They have come because they are very large and Melos is very small, and in their empire that gap has only one resolution. Or so they believe. What happens next is strange, and the strangeness of it is easy to miss if you are moving too quickly through the story. The Melians decide they will not let the Athenians address the full assembly. Think about what that means. There is a gathering of people somewhere on that island, an ordinary gathering of citizens who will decide whether their city lives or dies, and the leaders, the small council of oligarchs who hold the decision-making power in Melos, have quietly, carefully kept the door shut. The Athenian envoys are not permitted to walk into the room where everyone is listening. They are permitted only to speak to a much smaller group, the rulers themselves, the few men at the top. And the reason the Melian leaders give, if you read Thucydides carefully, is this: they were afraid. Not afraid of the Athenians exactly, afraid of the Athenians' words. Afraid that if the envoys were allowed to speak to the whole assembled people, the people might be swayed. A single persuasive speech, reaching into a crowd that is already frightened, might tip the room toward capitulation before the council had a chance to frame the question properly. So the leaders controlled the room. This is one of those moments in history where a small, almost administrative decision turns out to contain everything. The Melian leaders thought they were protecting their negotiating position. They thought they were being careful, and in one sense they were. But what they did, without quite knowing it, was to ensure that the exchange between the great power and the small island would take place in the most compressed, exposed, rigorous form possible, a direct back and forth between a handful of men, no crowd to play to, no gallery, no performance, just claim and counterclaim, question and answer, each side seeing exactly what the other is doing. Nothing to hide behind. This is actually why the Melian dialogue reads the way it does. It is written differently from everything else in Thucydides. Almost everything else in the history takes the form of paired formal speeches. One general speaks before the battle, then another general speaks, and you read them in order like two monologues. But the Melian dialogue is written as something closer to a conversation, a give and take. Thucydides chose the most intimate, most exposed form of exchange for this particular episode, something almost Socratic, question following question, position being tested and tested again. And partly that choice reflects what actually happened in that room. Two sides, a small number of men, no audience to address, just each other. It is worth letting that settle. The Melians tried to control information by limiting the audience, and the result was a philosophical dialogue that has been read and reread and argued over for 2,500 years. Power can be contained, for a little while, in a room. Ideas do not fit so neatly. So the envoys and the council sit together, and the Athenians speak first. And what they say at the outset is something almost no one mentions when they describe this event, which is a pity, because it is the most important thing they say. The Athenians tell the Melians, before anything else, that this conversation should not be about justice. Not because justice is a bad word, not because they despise it, but because, they explain, they both know that justice, as a concept that actually changes what happens, only functions in a very specific situation. Justice requires two things to be real. It requires that the parties be roughly equal in power, and it requires that there be some third authority above both of them capable of enforcing whatever standard they both agree to. Take either of those away, and you are no longer in the realm of justice. You are in a different realm, and pretending otherwise wastes everyone's time. This is the actual claim the Athenians are making at Thucydides 589, and it is worth pausing on, because it is harder and stranger and more honest than the famous condensed version you may have encountered. The strong do what they can, and the weak suffer what they must. That is the version that has echoed down the centuries, and there is a real idea inside it. But the real version is more specific. The Athenians are not saying that justice is a fiction. They are saying that justice is a function. It works when conditions are right. When conditions are wrong, invoking it is not an argument, it is a wish. Put it this way, slowly, because this is the heart of everything that follows. Imagine a disagreement between two neighbours. One of them has done something the other thinks is wrong. The wronged neighbour has a few options. They can appeal to a shared rule, there is a law about this, and we both agreed to it. They can appeal to a shared institution, there is a court, or a community council, or some body that both of us recognise as having the authority to decide. Or they can appeal to a shared sense of fairness. We have a relationship, we live near each other, there is something between us that makes both of us want to do right. Any of these can work. What makes them work is that there is something above and beyond both neighbours, a rule, an institution, a relationship, some shared thing that neither neighbour unilaterally controls, but that both have agreed in some form to respect. Now imagine instead that one of the neighbours is 10 times larger than the other, and has no obligation to any institution above them, and has made clear from the beginning that they will decide this themselves. What changes? Everything. The small neighbour can still say that's not fair. But the word fair is no longer attached to any mechanism that can enforce it. It is floating in the air. The large neighbour can hear it and feel nothing, because there is nothing in the situation that converts the small neighbour's appeal into a cost or a consequence for the large one. The word fair has become, in that situation, purely a description of the small neighbour's wishes. And wishes are not arguments. This is what the Athenians are articulating. They are not monsters. They are, in a cold and uncomfortable way, being precise. They are describing the structure of the situation they are both in and declining to let either side dress it up in language that implies a structure that doesn't exist. There is no common authority above Athens and Melos. There is no court to which Melos can appeal. There is no power that both sides recognize as having the right to make a binding decision. Under those conditions, the Athenians say, "Let us speak only of what is real." And the real thing is this: Athens is very large, and Melos is very small, and Athens needs a resolution. This mechanism, the absence of a shared enforcer, the collapse of fairness as an operative force, has a name in modern political thought. Scholars who study the relations between nations call it anarchy. Not in the sense of chaos, but in the precise etymological sense, an arch without a ruler above. No world government exists above separate nations. No enforcer can compel a great power to honor terms it has decided to break. And so, in the space between nations, the same logic applies that the Athenians are naming here. Justice operates only where some shared authority can guarantee it. Between truly unequal parties with no common referee, it functions, at most, as persuasion. And persuasion requires that the other party has reasons to listen. You will recognize this, not from ancient history, from somewhere closer. Think of a negotiation at work between an employee and a company that holds all the leverage, where the formal process is slow and the practical reality is that the employee needs the job more than the company needs that particular employee. The employee can say that's not fair, and perhaps it isn't. But fair will not change the outcome unless it is attached to something that makes the company feel a cost, a legal obligation, a reputational consequence, a union, something real above both parties. Without that, the word floats. Think of a small supplier trying to negotiate terms with a dominant buyer who represents 70% of the supplier's revenue. The supplier can say, "These terms aren't fair." And they may be right. But right is not a lever in that room if there is no regulator, no alternative buyer, no coalition with other suppliers, no shared authority above the two parties that can convert the supplier's grievance into the buyer's problem. Think of a child and a parent in the particular kind of conversation where the child says, "That's not fair." And the parent, because they hold all the power in the house, can simply choose not to engage. The child is not wrong about fairness. But the child has no mechanism, which is why "that's not fair" from a child, in some conversations, lands precisely nowhere until the child is older and has built leverage of some kind or found an adult outside the house who can intervene. This is not a counsel of despair. We will get to the narrow room in which the powerless can still move, because it exists, and because Thucydides is careful about it. But the first thing, the honest, cold, important first thing, is to see the structure clearly. If you are in a situation where no shared authority exists above you and the party you are dealing with, then your most powerful move is probably not to appeal to their sense of justice. You are not inside the conditions where justice is a force. Something else may reach them, but it will not be that. The Athenians understood this. They understood it so well that they stated it out loud, which is almost the most remarkable thing about the dialogue. The great power did not pretend. They named what was happening. Let us rest here for a moment. Take a slow, deep breath. In through the nose, gently, filling the belly first, then the chest. And out, slowly, the breath releasing and the body settling just a little more into whatever is holding you right now. There is no hurry. The story will be here when you come back to it. The island will be there. The ships will be there. The men in the room will still be sitting across from each other. Quick reminder, after years of lying awake with a racing mind, deep sleep finally became possible. Now learning comes easier, energy is real, and the mind stays sharp. Sleeping like a baby changed everything. If you want the exact system that made this possible, check the link in the pinned comments. When you are ready, we will continue together. The room is still. The Melian council and the Athenian envoys. The question that cannot be answered with justice alone hanging between them. Let us continue, softly. Before we can fully understand what is said in that room, we need to understand something about the island itself. Something the standard account almost always flattens into a single word: neutral. Melos was neutral, the story goes. Athens attacked a neutral island. And there is truth in that framing, but it is the kind of truth that smooths away all the texture, and the texture turns out to matter enormously. Melos was not simply a small peaceful island minding its own business in a sea that happened to be contested. Melos had a history and a lineage and a specific place in the complicated genealogy of Greek identity that made its position in 416 BC far less simple than the word neutral implies. It was a Dorian island, a colony of Sparta, which the Greeks called Lacedaemon. In the Greek world of the 5th century, this is not a minor biographical detail. The great division of the Aegean in this period runs along an ethnic and cultural fault line. On one side, the Ionians, of whom Athens was the mother city, the cultural and military centre, the self-appointed protectors. On the other side, the Dorians, of whom Sparta was the great power, the rival to Athens, the other pole of the Greek world. These were not simply political allegiances, they went deep into dialect and ritual and a sense of kinship so old and woven through everything that it shaped how people understood themselves. Melos was Dorian, Spartakin. In an Aegean that Athens had increasingly converted from a voluntary alliance into an empire, Melos was an island that felt itself to be, by blood and by tradition, on the other side. The Delian League began in 478 BCE as a partnership. Athens and a collection of Aegean island states came together after the Persian Wars to maintain a defensive coalition, to keep the Persian threat at bay, to protect the freedom of Greek cities. Everyone contributed ships or money to a common treasury housed on the sacred island of Delos, and the whole thing had the feeling of genuine shared purpose in the beginning. Athens led, but Athens led because Athens had the navy and the organizational capacity, not because the other members had surrendered. By 454 BC, the treasury had been moved, not to Delos, to Athens. A treasury moved to the leading city's capital is a different kind of treasury. And by the middle of the 5th century, the Delian League had become, in function and in practice, and in the experience of its member states, the Athenian Empire. Allies who tried to leave were brought back by force. Dissenters were punished. The tribute was spent in Athens, on Athenian monuments, on Athenian power. Melos never joined. Melos never contributed to the treasury, never paid the tribute, never became a subject ally, and Athens had already tried, 10 years before the dialogue, to change that. In 426 BC, an Athenian general named Nicias, yes, the same Nicias who would later lead the disastrous Sicilian expedition, whose name becomes a word for cautious failure, sailed to Melos with a fleet. The records say he raided the island and then left without subduing it. Melos held out. The Athenians went away. This matters because it tells you something about the Melians' state of mind when 416 arrived and the ships came back. They had seen this before. They had faced an Athenian fleet before, and the Athenians had eventually left. That memory of survival, that precedent, that proof that it was possible, was sitting in the room with the council when the Athenian envoys arrived. History can be a comfort, but it can also be a trap, because past situations are never quite the same as the present one, and what worked at a different moment against a different level of Athenian commitment is not reliable evidence that the same approach will work now. The Athenians were more serious this time, the fleet was larger, the determination was different. And the context had changed in another way too. Melos was not the first island to find itself in this position. Athens had been here before, and the Melians would have known what happened in those previous cases, which should have been, if they were paying attention, a piece of sobering information. In 427 BC, the island of Lesbos, and specifically its main city, Mytilene, revolted from the Athenian Empire. The revolt was suppressed. And then Athens held a debate about what to do with the Mytileneans. The debate has its own name, the Mytilenean debate. And we will return to it, because it contains the most important lesson in the whole history for anyone who has ever needed to move a powerful party without having power themselves. But for now, the relevant fact is simply this. After the revolt was crushed, Athens voted. They voted, in a fit of rage, to execute all the men of Mytilene and enslave the women and children. Then, the next morning, they voted again, and the second vote overturned the first. A ship was sent racing to catch the ship that carried the first order, and it arrived in time. Mytilene was spared. But not Cyone. Cyone was another city that revolted in 421 BC, and there was no second vote for Cyone. The men were killed, the women and children enslaved. Athens decreed it, and Athens carried it out. And this was not ancient history from the Melians' perspective. Cyone fell the same year as the Peace of Nicias, just 5 years before the dialogue. 5 years. Some of the men sitting in the council room in Melos, listening to the Athenian envoys, would have been young adults when Cyone was erased. They would have known what Athens was capable of. They would have had no excuse for imagining that Athens's previous departure from their island meant the matter was permanently settled. What this tells us about the event we are examining is that Melos was not an aberration. Melos was a policy. The pattern already existed. Ally or be destroyed. Contribute or be made to contribute by force. Remain inside the empire or demonstrate what happens to those outside it. Athens had done this at Sion. Athens had almost done it at Mytilene. Athens had done it to cities who resisted. And now Athens had returned to Melos with more ships and less patience than they had brought in 426. The Melian leaders knew all of this. The council members in that room knew all of this. That they chose to negotiate from the position they chose, that they framed the conversation the way they did, is not evidence of ignorance. It is evidence of something else, a set of beliefs about who would intervene on their behalf, and whether fortune would favour the pious, and whether honour demanded that they stand firm. That turned out, in the event, to be exactly wrong. We will examine each of those beliefs in turn, because they are instructive in the specific way that honest mistakes are instructive, not as evidence of stupidity, but as evidence of how even intelligent, responsible people can reason themselves into catastrophe when they are using faulty assumptions as their foundation. But first, a piece of the story that belongs here, that reframes what the Athenians are doing and why. The standard telling casts the Athenians as aggressors motivated by greed or dominance. Strong wants what weak has. Big eats small. This is not exactly wrong, but it misses the most interesting and unsettling thing about the Athenian position, which is the actual reason they give for why Melos has to be brought inside the empire. It is not greed. It is not resources. Melos is a small island, not a treasure house, not a critical port, not a strategic choke point that Athens needs to control the sea lanes. Athens is not attacking Melos because of what Melos has. Athens is attacking Melos because of what Melos means. The Athenians say this explicitly in the dialogue, and it is one of those moments where the honesty is almost harder to hear than a lie would have been. They explain their reasoning at Thucydides 595-97 with a kind of institutional precision. The empire they hold is maintained not just by military force, but by something more fragile and more powerful than force, the perception of force. Their subject cities do not stay subjects purely because Athens has more ships. They stay subjects, in part, because they believe Athens will act, and will act decisively, and will not make exceptions. An empire that tolerates a free city on its doorstep, a small island that refuses to pay tribute and simply goes on living its independent life, while Athenian subject states contribute their money and their ships, sends a message. Not an intended message, not a deliberate one, but a message nonetheless. The message is, perhaps there are exceptions. Perhaps resistance is possible. Perhaps Athens does not always follow through. That message, once circulating, is a disease in an empire. Subject states begin to calculate. If Melos can refuse and survive, why not us? If independence is an option for some, why not for those who chafe most under the obligation? The empire is built on the assumption that there are no exceptions, and a free Melos is a visible, living exception. And so, and here is the counterintuitive thing, the thing that makes the Athenian logic both colder and more comprehensible than the cartoon version. The Athenians are not acting from confidence. They are acting from something closer to anxiety. They need Melos, not because Melos is valuable, but because allowing Melos to remain free is, within the internal logic of empire maintenance, a vulnerability. The strong are not always acting from strength. Sometimes they are acting to defend a position they are not entirely sure they can hold. This is worth sitting with because it inverts the usual picture. We imagine the powerful as serene, as motivated by appetite, as reaching out a hand and taking what they want, because wanting it is enough. But the Athenian case at Melos is the picture of a great power in a permanent state of managerial anxiety about its own image. They need to project invulnerability because they are not actually invulnerable. The empire is a thing they must constantly perform, and every piece of it that resists the performance threatens the whole. And then Thucydides goes further, because Thucydides always goes further. The Athenians not only explain why they need to bring Melos inside the empire, they also explain why they cannot simply leave Melos alone and call it a friendship. The Melians had offered exactly this. They said, "Let us not be your subjects. Let us be your friends. We will remain neutral. We will not help your enemies. We will simply continue to exist as we have existed." Can we not do that? And the Athenians said no. And the reason they said no is one of the most revealing sentences in the whole dialogue, because it captures something true about the internal logic of dominance that most people never quite articulate. They said, "If we allow you to be free and call you friends." Our subjects will see our friendship as weakness. Our subjects will read that as evidence that we cannot compel. Whereas if you remain hostile and we leave you alone, our subjects will see it and think we are afraid of you, that even an island our size cannot subdue has managed to stop us. In other words, there is no outcome in which Melos exists freely that looks good for Athens. A free, friendly Melos says to the empire, "You can refuse Athens and be befriended." A hostile, free Melos says, "You can resist Athens and survive." Either way, the message that circulates among the subject states is dangerous. The only message that does not threaten the empire's coherence is, Melos is inside the empire now. Not an exception. Not a friend who stayed outside. A subject, like everyone else. This is what the Athenians mean when they present themselves as acting from an inherited law, a law already existing, a law they found when they arrived at their power and that they will leave behind them when they are gone. They inherited an empire, and empires have a logic, and the logic says that exceptions are existential. They did not create this situation. They are managing it. They are managing it without mercy, but they are managing it with a very clear theory of what they are doing and why. The man who recorded this, who sat with it, who turned it into the form we can still read tonight, was a man who had been on the other side of exactly this logic. Thucydides had been the great power's instrument, and then he had failed. And then the great power had discarded him. He had 20 years of exile in which to think about what he had seen. He came back from that exile with something unusual, the ability to look at a great power's reasoning and write it down without lying about it, without sanitizing it, without letting either side off the hook for being what they were. His stripping away of the mythical and the self-serving from history, what he called to methods, the elements that make a story comfortable but untrue, he applied with the same precision to the arguments of his own city, in this dialogue, in this exchange, that he applied to everything else. The man who wrote the coldest and most honest truth about power was a man that power had thrown away. This is not a coincidence. It is almost a law. The clear-eyed view of the machinery tends to belong to those who have been through it and come out the other side, not to those still inside it, still benefiting from its turning gears, still invested in its flattering self-descriptions. He wrote, near the beginning of his history, that he was composing not for immediate acclaim, but as a possession for all time, ktema es aie, a thing to be kept, not a speech to be heard once and forgotten. And what makes a thing worth keeping is not that it tells a satisfying story, but that it tells a true one, a story whose truth remains recognizable across the long rotations of history. Because what it describes is not the particular customs of one place and time, but the underlying grammar of how power, in the absence of common authority, actually moves. He believed that grammar was stable. He believed that human nature being what it is, similar situations would produce similar dynamics, and that the person who had studied those dynamics carefully would be less surprised, less helpless when they found themselves inside one, not invulnerable, not saved, but less helpless, with a slightly better map. That is why we are here, in the middle of this old story, in the quiet of this night, not because it offers comfort in the way that comfort is usually offered, not because it resolves into kindness or mercy or the triumph of the good, but because there is a different kind of comfort in understanding clearly, in finally having a name for a structure you have felt but never quite articulated, in being told that the thing that happened to you, or the thing you are afraid might happen, has happened before, and has a logic, and the logic can be studied. The cold water is still cold. But knowing that it is cold, and knowing precisely why, is not nothing. Let us go deeper into the room. Now let us listen to the Athenians more carefully and hear how they answer each of the arguments the Melians bring forward, one by one, with that particular calm that belongs to parties who are very confident they have already won. The Melians have 4 things they are holding on to. 4 reasons to believe that their situation is not as hopeless as it looks. 4 places where they have hidden their hope. And the Athenians are about to dismantle all 4 with a precision that is, in its way, a kind of teaching. But let that come slowly. Let the story keep the pace it has been keeping. There is no urgency here. The night is deep, and the room is warm, and you have drifted further into the ease of just listening than you perhaps realized. The body has been settling all this while, inch by inch, muscle by muscle, into something that is very close to rest. The thoughts that came to you when you first lay down, the things you were turning over, the conversations you were replaying, the calculations you were making about tomorrow, or the week, or the long uncertain future, those thoughts have been moving further away, not gone, but not close either. Further, the way a sound grows quieter when a door is closed between you and it. The island is still there, the 2 sides are still in the room, and we are going to hear what each of them says about hope, about the gods, about Sparta, about honor. We are going to watch the Melians reach for each of those 4 things, and watch the Athenians answer each reach with something that feels less like cruelty than like geometry, the cool, impersonal demonstration that the shape of this does not support the weight you are trying to put on it. The Athenians, in their way, are offering the Melians something, not what the Melians want, but something. They are offering clarity. And in the morning, when the night has moved through its own unmeasured hours and you surface slowly into the room and the light, you may find that you have taken some of that clarity with you. Not the cold part, not the part about empire, but the quieter part, the part that says, see the structure first. Name it clearly, then decide, within the structure as it actually is, what you can do. Not what you wish were true, not what you deserve, what you can actually do. And sometimes, when you have seen it clearly enough, there are more options than you thought. Not many, but more than none. And that is enough for now. The lesson in the room is still unfolding. The night is still long. There is no need to reach for the end of it before it arrives. Just keep breathing, slowly, and let the story come to you. So, the first thing the Melians reach for is hope. This is not unusual. It may be the most human thing there is. When the situation is difficult, and the options are narrow, and the person across the table holds most of the power, the first thing almost anyone does is reach past the situation as it is, and hold on to the possibility that the situation might change, that something might happen, that the mathematics might shift, that fortune, which had not been favourable, might turn. The Melians say something like this to the Athenians. They say that fortune is unpredictable. They say that the gods favour the just, and that the just have sometimes prevailed against the strong. They say that they will trust in that, in the possibility of it, in the idea that this is not necessarily over because it looks, at this moment, as if it might be over. And the Athenians listen. And then the Athenians do something that is worth sitting with for a moment, because it is not what you might expect from men who have just arrived with 38 ships and 3,000 soldiers and a demand for surrender. They do not mock the Melians for hoping. They diagnose it. There is a line in Thucydides, and again, These are reconstructed words. This is the historian's laboratory. Not a court transcript, but the idea the Athenians express is one of the most precisely aimed psychological observations in the whole of the history. They say this, or something very close to this: hope is the comforter of those in danger. But hope is also extravagant by nature, and hope is only a safe thing to carry if you have abundant resources elsewhere, if, when your hope fails, something else remains to catch you. For those who have nothing in reserve, hope is not a comfort. It is the specific thing that destroys them, because it delays the moment of clear sight. It holds the mind inside a version of events that does not exist, while the version that does exist is tightening around you. They call it the comforter of those in danger. And they say it as a warning. Slow down for a moment with that. The Athenians are not saying that hope is foolish in general. They are making a much more precise claim. They are saying that hope, without resources to fall back on, is not a virtue. It is a trap. It is the thing that prevents a clear accounting of what you actually have. And for those who have very little, for the cornered, the outmatched, the genuinely weak, hope is the most expensive luxury of all, because it costs them the time and the clarity they can least afford to spend. There is something in that worth carrying into the quiet of tonight. Not the cold version of it, not the part about empire and defeat, but the smaller, more intimate version. The way that hope, in a difficult moment, can sometimes be the thing that keeps you from seeing the situation as it actually is. The way that holding on to how things might turn out can sometimes prevent you from asking what, given how things actually are, you can do right now. That is not the end of hope. It is not a reason to abandon hope altogether. It is a question about what kind of hope you are carrying. Is it a hope that keeps you moving, that gives you energy for action, that opens options? Or is it a hope that holds you still, waiting for a change that is not coming, while the situation continues to develop around you in the direction it was already going? The Athenians would say those are different things, and they would say the Melians have confused them. Breathe slowly. You do not need to agree with the Athenians. You do not need to think they are right about everything, but you can notice the precision of the observation. You can notice that it is not cruelty. It is something more like a doctor telling a patient the truth about their condition, a truth that is harder to hear than reassurance, but that might, if the patient could bear to hear it, actually help. The Melians cannot quite bear to hear it, and so they reach for the second thing. They reach for the gods. They say that they are pious. They say that they have not wronged the Athenians. They say that the gods protect the just, and that the gods will be on their side when it matters. Now, the Athenian response to this is one of the strangest and most remarkable passages in the entire dialogue, because the Athenians do not say, "There are no gods." They do not dismiss the divine. They do not argue theology in the way you might expect men who are about to commit a great violence to argue theology, by denying that there is anyone watching. Instead, they say something that is harder to answer. They say that they believe the gods obey the same law of nature that governs men, that the law they are describing, the law that the stronger rule where they can, that power determines what is possible between parties who are unequal, is not a human invention, a cynical choice, a moral failure. They say it is a natural law. And they say that the gods themselves, by their own nature, act according to it, that the gods rule where they can, as men do. They are not atheists in that moment. They are making a stranger claim. They are saying that the architecture of power is the architecture of everything, divine and human alike. That the Melians' appeal to divine favour assumes that the gods operate by a different set of rules than the ones that govern the rest of existence. And the Athenians say, with a kind of cold serenity, that they see no evidence of that. This is worth holding gently, because what the Athenians are really saying is that the Melians' appeal to heaven has the same structure as every other appeal the Melians are making. It imports a referee into a situation that has no referee. It says, yes, you have the ships and the soldiers, but there is something above you, some authority, some principle that will intervene. And the Athenians keep answering, there is no such authority here. Not in the Athenian assembly, which does what power permits, not in the gods, who do what their nature permits. The appeal is always to something above the parties. And the Athenians keep pointing out, patiently, relentlessly, that between parties of unequal power with no common enforcer, there is nothing above the parties. The structure of the Melians' argument is the same each time. There is something above this, something that will correct it. And the Athenians keep saying, softly and without gloating, show us. So the Melians reach for the third thing, and this one, of the four, is the one they believe in most, the one they are most sure of, the one that has kept them going through the earlier raid, through the years of resistance, through the knowledge that Athens has been looking at their island with impatient eyes for a long time. They reach for Sparta. Melos was a colony of Sparta, a Dorian city in a sea that Athens, Ionian by heritage, had turned into an empire. The connection to Sparta was not merely diplomatic. It was ancestral. It was the kind of bond that in the ancient world was expected to mean something real. Sparta was the mother city. Honour and kinship would require Sparta to act. The Athenians listen to this argument too. And then they take it apart, quietly, in the way they have taken apart everything else. They say, you are counting on Sparta to cross the sea and fight Athens on naval grounds where Athens is strongest. You are counting on Sparta to do this not because it serves Sparta's interests, but because of honour, because of kinship, because of the shame of letting a colony fall. And the Athenians say, you have misunderstood how Sparta decides things. Sparta, they say, is a city that has its own excellent virtues. Sparta is admirable in many ways. But Sparta is also a city that understands self-interest very clearly, and that measures risk very carefully, and that does not go to war at sea against a naval empire in full possession of the Aegean to rescue a distant island because of kinship alone. Sparta will weigh the cost. Sparta will weigh the probability. Sparta will look at the water between itself and Melos, and at the Athenian fleet on that water, and it will make a calculation. And the Melians, the Athenians say, have been counting on a version of Sparta that acts on honour rather than calculation, a version that will accept enormous cost and risk because of love. The Athenians do not believe that version exists. Not reliably. Not in a crisis where survival is genuinely at stake. They are right. Sparta does not come. Not that day. Not during the siege. Not at the surrender. The connection the Melians trusted, the kinship they believed would hold when nothing else did, was real in the way many things are real, meaningful in peacetime, costly in crisis, and not a foundation on which to stake everything. Let us stay with that for a moment too. Not to be harsh about it, but because there is something in it that most of us have felt, in smaller versions, in our own lives. The person you were certain would stand beside you in the difficult moment. The institution you had always believed would protect you when things went wrong. The principle you had counted on being enforced because it had always seemed to be enforced, because you had always operated inside the conditions where its enforcement was invisible and therefore felt like a fact of the world rather than a fragile arrangement. And then the difficult moment arrives, and you discover that the person has their own situation, their own calculation, their own cost. You discover that the institution is not designed to protect you specifically, but to maintain a broader equilibrium that in this instance does not require your protection. You discover that the principle requires an enforcer, and the enforcer has decided for its own reasons that this is not the moment. This is not, most of the time, betrayal in the melodramatic sense. It is something more ordinary and in some ways more sobering. It is the difference between what a relationship means and what it can bear, between what a principle says and what happens when the cost of honouring it becomes high enough that the party responsible for honouring it must choose. The Melians counted on Sparta bearing that cost. Sparta decided not to. And so the Melians reach for the fourth thing, the last thing. The thing that is, in some ways, the most purely human of all. They reach for honour. They say that to surrender without fighting, to simply hand the city over, to become a subject, to accept the terms and survive, would be shameful. That there is a kind of dishonour in yielding to overwhelming force. That to die in defence of your freedom is better than to live as a subject of the empire that took it. And here the Athenians say something that is almost, in its own strange way, gentle. They say, there is no shame in this. They say it with something close to sincerity. They say that yielding to the greatest power in Hellas when it offers moderate terms is not cowardice. It is wisdom. The Greek word they use maps to something like prudence, like self-preservation, like the clear-eyed understanding that surviving to fight another day, or simply surviving, is not a betrayal of your dignity. It is a recognition of what your life is worth. The Athenians are not gloating in this moment. They are, in their own terms, trying to talk the Melians out of a catastrophic error. They are saying, what you are calling honour, we are calling the waste of something irreplaceable. We are not asking you to renounce who you are. We are asking you to stay alive. And the Melians say no. Slow down again. Stay with the structure of that. Because the Athenians have not, at this point, demanded the worst. What they are offering is subjection, not annihilation. Tribute, membership in the empire, unwilling membership perhaps, but membership nonetheless. The continuation of the city. The continuation of the people in it. Lives, unbroken, diminished in freedom, yes, but intact. What they are refusing is Melian independence, not Melian existence. This is not a detail. This is the hinge on which the whole tragedy turns. Because the Melians do not understand, in this room, during this negotiation, that there is a difference between what they are being asked to lose and what they will lose if they refuse. They treat subjection and annihilation as equivalent, as both being forms of defeat, and therefore as being morally equivalent choices. If we are going to be defeated either way, they seem to reason, we would rather be defeated fighting than defeated surrendering. At least then we kept our honour. At least then we stood for something. But they are not equivalent. One is survivable, one is not. Pride in this room does not distinguish between them. Pride says, if I must fall, let me fall on my own terms. And that is an understandable thing to feel. It is an ancient thing to feel. It is woven into the way human beings think about dignity and selfhood and what it means to have mattered. But the Athenians are pointing at something that cuts underneath the feeling. They are pointing at the fact that falling on your own terms will, in this instance, mean not only your fall, but the fall of every person in the city behind you. The women, the children, the people who did not choose this negotiation, the people who are not in this room, but whose lives will be decided by what this room produces. The question the Athenians are asking is not, are you brave enough to fight? The question is, are you clear-eyed enough to know when fighting will not save what you love? There is no drama in the way I am saying this to you tonight. There is no urgency. It is very late. The room where this negotiation happened is 2,400 years gone. The Melians are past choosing. The Athenians are past arguing. But the question lives. It lives in every place where a person is holding on to a position, not because it will help the people they love, but because letting it go feels like a kind of dying. Not a physical dying, but the dying of a self-image. The death of the story you have been telling about who you are and what you stand for. Sometimes that dying is worth it. Sometimes the thing you are standing for is actually worth the cost. Sometimes the line you refuse to cross is the right line. But sometimes, and this is the harder thing to say, sometimes what we are protecting is not the people in the city behind us. It is the version of ourselves that can look in the mirror and feel like we did not back down. Those two things can look identical from the outside. They are not. The Melians vote to resist. Athens begins the siege. The siege is not quick. These things rarely are. The walls of a city, even a small city, require time to reduce, time and patience, and the slow accumulation of pressure. The Athenians build circumvallation walls around Melos, the kind of fortifications that cut a city off from the outside world and wait for it to exhaust itself. They leave a garrison and rotate their main forces away for other business. The empire has many other concerns. Melos is not the only thing on the table. Inside the walls, the Melians wait. They are waiting still for Sparta to come, or for fortune to turn, or for the siege to become too costly for Athens to maintain. They are holding on to the possibility that something will change. Something does change, but not in the direction they needed. Some of the Melians themselves betray the city from within. We do not know who they were. Thucydides does not name them. We do not know what they were promised, or what they believed, or whether they acted out of desperation or calculation or simple terror. What we know is that the siege that might have dragged on longer found its resolution, partly because people inside the walls opened a way through. There is something in that detail, quiet as it is, that says something true about the limits of collective resistance under sustained pressure. When the hope that has been keeping people going begins to run out, when it becomes clear that Sparta is not coming, that fortune has not turned, that the walls are holding, but only barely and only for now, the calculation that individuals make about their own survival begins to diverge from the collective decision. This is not a moral condemnation. It is a human observation, the same one Thucydides makes throughout the history about city after city, faction after faction. Sustained pressure finds the seams. And the seams in a community are the places where individual calculation and collective decision are no longer aligned. The Melians surrender. Unconditionally, the winter of 416 into 415 BCE, the 16th year of the war, the year of the Peace of Nicias that had not stopped much of anything. And Thucydides records what happens next in a single sentence. He does not editorialize. He does not say it was monstrous. He does not say it was just. He does not say what he thinks about it. He records it the way you might record a weather event, the way you might note that the temperature fell, or that the rain came, or that something that had been standing was no longer standing. The Athenians killed all the grown men they captured. They sold the women and children into slavery, and they sent 500 of their own colonists to settle the island. Read that again. Not quickly, not rushing toward the next thing. A community of some thousands of people, a town, a real place with houses and markets and people who had known each other for generations, people with names and arguments and memories and favourite places to sit in the evening, erased, the men gone. The women and children carried away to whatever the Aegean slave markets would give for them. And then, in the silence left behind, 500 Athenian colonists arriving to begin again on the same ground, as if the previous inhabitants had been a temporary condition that had now resolved. Thucydides uses about 30 words for it. That restraint is not an accident. Thucydides had already told us at the very beginning of his work what he thought a historian was for. He had said that he was not writing for the pleasure of the listener. He had said he was not trying to win a prize or tell a pleasing story or make people feel good about the past. He had stripped out what he called to mythods, the mythical element, the comforting legends, the stories shaped more for satisfaction than for truth. He said his work would be less pleasing to hear for that reason. And then he wrote 30 words about the end of Melos. The restraint is the indictment. He gives the Athenians all their space. He lets them make their argument in full. He lets them be coherent, even compelling. He gives them the most sophisticated and precisely reasoned position of anyone in the dialogue. He does not put clumsy words in their mouths. He does not make them into cartoons. And then he writes, and they killed the men and enslaved the women and children and settled 500 colonists. The contrast between the length and sophistication of the argument and the brevity of the outcome, that contrast is itself a form of commentary, even without a single word of judgment. The argument was long. The result was short. The argument was complex. The result was simple. And the silence after the sentence is where Thucydides leaves you. In that silence, if you are paying attention, you begin to understand something about what kind of writer Thucydides was. He was not a propagandist for Athens. He was not celebrating what happened. He was also not, in that moment, explicitly condemning it. He was doing something harder and more enduring. He was making you feel, through the shape of the narrative itself, through the placement of the sentence, through the bluntness of the prose, what he could not say directly as a historian committed to stripping out the comforting myth. He was showing you what the argument leads to, not telling you it was wrong, showing you where it goes. And this, for those of us sitting with the dialogue in the quiet of a late night, is one of the most important things to understand about Thucydides. He built his work as a possession for all time, that phrase again, ktema es aie, a gift to the future. Because he believed that human nature being what it is, similar situations would recur, that what happened in this room, on this island, in this year, would happen again. Not identically, not with the same names and the same ships, but with the same structure. A powerful party with no external constraint. A weaker party appealing to principles that require an enforcer. And no enforcer in the room. That structure, he believed, recurs, And he believed that if you had read this carefully, if you had sat with the argument and the outcome and the silence after the 30 words, you would recognize it when you saw it again. In a different room, on a different scale, with different words being used for the same fundamental positions. Tonight, in the dark, while the room is still and the hours are passing their unhurried way into morning, you can feel the weight of that sentence. Not the horror of it exactly, though the horror is real and should not be smoothed away, but something else, something that sits alongside the horror and is, in its own way, even more disquieting. The argument was good. The argument was coherent. The argument was, within its own logic, correct, and the argument led here, to 30 words and a silence, which means that coherence is not the same as wisdom, that a position can be logically consistent and lead to a place you would not choose to go if you had seen the destination clearly at the start. The Athenians saw the destination clearly. That is, in a way, the most disturbing thing about them. They were not deceived, they were not irrational. They chose with full clarity to go exactly where they went. And Thucydides, who had been a general of Athens, who had served the city and been exiled by it, who had spent 20 years watching both sides of the war from the outside, wrote it all down without blinking. He had already told the Melians, through the voices of the Athenians in his reconstruction, that the law that the strong rule where they can is a law that preceded Athens and would survive it, that Athens found it already existing and would leave it to exist after them, that they had not invented it and would not be the last to use it. He wrote that. And then he kept writing. And the next chapter, the very next chapter, Book 6, the first page after the 30 cold words about Melos, the next chapter opens with Athens debating whether to invade Sicily. That is not a coincidence. That is architecture. That is a writer who knows exactly what he is doing, building something that will take the attentive reader by surprise, not with a plot twist, not with a revelation that changes the facts, but with a shift in perspective so quiet and so clean that you might read past it if you are not paying attention. You watch Athens at Melos. You watch Athens be right, be coherent, be powerful. You watch Athens give a perfect demonstration of what power looks like when it operates without a referee. And then you turn the page, and Athens is deciding to go to Sicily. And if you have been paying attention, something in you goes very still. Because you already know where arguments like this lead, you have just watched one finish. But we will come to Sicily in its own time. The night is not finished yet. The dialogue is not finished yet. And there is still something important to understand about the room at Melos before we move forward, something about what the Melians could have done, something about the narrow space that remained, something about the one time that Athens actually was talked out of a massacre and how that talking was done. That is still ahead. For now, let us rest inside the weight of what we have already been given. A small island, a large fleet, an argument made with precision and answered with equal precision. 4 things the Melians reached for: hope, the gods, Sparta, honour, and 4 times the shape did not support the weight. An offer to survive, rejected, a siege, a betrayal, a surrender. And 30 words. Whatever you are carrying tonight, and you are carrying something, everyone is carrying something, that is part of what the night is for, you can let it sit beside all of this without needing to resolve it. The weight of your own thing does not have to be compared to the weight of Melos. They are different weights, different scales, different kinds of difficulty. But there is something in the shape of it that speaks to something in the shape of us. the reaching for the thing that will change everything, the belief that the structure is not as fixed as it appears, the hope that something above the situation will intervene. The moment when it becomes clear that it will not, and the choice that has to be made in that moment, the choice between a bad outcome and a worse one, between a pride that costs everything and a humility that costs only the pride. Those shapes are old. Older than Thucydides, older than Athens. They are in the body of every person who has ever been in a room where the power was not evenly distributed and had to figure out what to say. You know that room. Maybe not with 38 ships on the horizon, maybe not with anything so vast and so final, but you know the feeling of looking across a table, or across a conversation, or across the particular silence that opens between two people when one of them holds much more than the other, and knowing that what you deserve and what you can argue for and what is fair are not the same thing as what will happen. You know that feeling. And Thucydides knew it too. He had been in rooms like that, not as a philosopher observing from outside, but as a general who lost his command, who was voted into exile by the very city he had served, who spent 20 years outside of power, watching what power does when it moves without constraint. The man who wrote the coldest, most precise thing about power had been discarded by it, and he used those 20 years to write something true. Not comfortable, not flattering, not designed to make Athens look good, or the gods look just, or the universe look fair. Just true, as far as he could make it. Stripped of the mythical element, stripped of the comforting legend. Written for the future, for the people who would come later and find themselves in similar situations and need, not consolation, but clarity. A possession for all time. The night breathes around you. The island of Melos is quiet now, has been quiet for 24 centuries. The sea that surrounded it is the same sea. The stones of the Cyclades are the same stones. Whatever has been built there since, whatever people have lived there since, the island goes on in the way that places go on, indifferent to the specific dramas that played out on their ground. And the question that Thucydides built into the pages of his history, the question about what happens when power has no referee, what happens to argument and justice and fairness and hope when the architecture does not support them. That question goes on too. It is still being asked. It is being asked in every negotiation where one party has most of what there is to have, and the other has very little. It is being asked in every room where someone says that's not fair, and the other party can afford to simply shrug. It is being asked in the places where there is no neutral third party to appeal to, no shared authority to invoke, no mechanism by which fair can be converted into actual. Thucydides did not think this was good. He did not think it was right. But he thought it was true. And he thought the truth was more useful than the comfortable story. Even if the truth was that justice, in those rooms, was not a force. Even if the truth was that it was a wish. What you do with a wish depends on whether you know it is a wish. If you think it is a certainty, you can wait for it, lean on it, build your whole strategy around it, right up until the moment when the certainty does not materialize and you are left with nothing. If you know it is a wish, you can still wish it. You do not have to stop. But you can also think about what you are going to do in the world as it is, rather than the world as you wish it were. The Athenians were trying to give the Melians that gift. The Melians could not receive it. And so here we are, in the soft hours of the night, sitting with the outcome of that inability. The men gone, the women and children taken. the colonists arriving on empty ground, and Thucydides, somewhere in his 20-year exile, writing it down in the belief that someone, someday, would read it and recognize the shape. You are here. You are reading it, or rather listening to it, in the way that listening in the dark has its own quality, its own softness, the words arriving not as information to be processed and organized, but as something to float inside of, to carry with you into whatever version of sleep is waiting. The night is still long. There is more to the story. There is the question of the one time Athens was talked out of destroying a city, and the lesson in how that happened. There is the long lineage of thought that flows out of this dialogue, through the centuries, through the work of men who read Thucydides, and built their own understanding of power on what he had written. There is the question of the narrow room the powerless still have to move in. The honest accounting of what can actually be done when the structure is as it is, and the ships are as many as they are. And there is what happens next. What happens on the very next page, in the very next chapter, when the argument that worked so perfectly at Melos meets a different island, a different situation, a different kind of overreach. We will come to all of that. For now, let the night do what the night does. Let the weight of this particular story settle into whatever part of you receives it. Let the Melians and the Athenians and the 30 cold words and the silence after them drift slowly into the background, becoming less sharp, the way images do when the mind begins to loosen its grip on them and let them become something more like texture than like thought. You do not need to hold any of this tightly. It will be here when you need it. The story has been here for 2,400 years. It will be here in the morning. There was one time, one recorded, documented, argued over time when the city of Athens looked directly at the question of whether to destroy a city and turned back. It happened 9 years before Melos. In 427 BC, during the third year of the war, Athens faced a rebellion in Mytilene, the main city of the island of Lesbos. Mytilene had been an ally, not a subject, one of the few remaining independent members of what had once been the Delian League. The anti-Persian alliance Athens had turned into an empire, and Mytilene had tried to leave. A revolt quickly put down, the city surrendered, and now the Athenian assembly met to decide what to do with it. They voted to kill every adult man in Mytilene, to enslave the women and children, to erase the political existence of the city entirely. A ship was dispatched with the order. And then something happened. The next day, the assembly met again. Not because the decision had been taken lightly, it had been debated, voted on, decided, but something sat wrong in the city overnight. Not justice, exactly, not a clean moral revulsion. Something more complicated than that, so the debate was reopened. And 2 men stood up to argue the question one more time. The first was Cleon. He was the most powerful popular politician in Athens at that moment, and he spoke for the original decision. His argument was not cruelty for its own sake. His argument was consistency and deterrence. He told the assembly that leniency was weakness, that mercy would signal to every other city that rebellion carried no final cost, that the empire required that the example be made. He was cold and he was logical, and he was, within his own framework, correct. The second man was Diodotus. And this is the part that matters. Diodotus did not argue that killing the Mytileneans was wrong. He never once said it was unjust. He never appealed to their innocence, never invoked the gods, never asked the assembly to feel compassion. never said anything that approached the language of moral obligation. What he said was that it was bad policy. He said that killing entire populations after a revolt does not deter future revolts, because the people in the next city considering rebellion will simply reason that their only hope, once the decision is made to revolt, is to fight to the death, since surrender leads to the same end anyway. He said that massacres train your enemies to die fighting rather than yield quickly, which costs Athens more in time and men and money. He said that inside every city that might revolt, the common people are not the instigators. They are usually persuaded or coerced by the oligarchic leaders, and if Athens signals that common people will die regardless, it removes the single most useful internal ally Athens has, which is the loyalty of the poor inside each city. He argued, in other words, that mercy was not just or unjust. Mercy was cheaper. Mercy was more effective. Mercy served Athenian interests. And he won. A second ship was sent, rowing hard to catch the first. The rowers fed and rested in shifts through the night so they could keep the pace, and it arrived just as the first ship was pulling into Mytilene harbour. The order was reversed in time. Most of the Mytileneans lived. Think about this for a moment. Not as a history lesson, as a mechanism. The assembly had decided on massacre. They reversed the decision not because someone moved them with the suffering of the Mytileneans, not because someone reminded them of justice or the gods or what it meant to be decent, but because someone made a careful case that their own long-term interests pointed in a different direction. The Melians, 9 years later, argued from justice. They appealed to fairness, to the gods, to the shame of what Athens was doing. They invoked what they deserved. They brought moral arguments to a negotiation that, as the Athenians had told them plainly at the start, was not a moral negotiation. And they died. Diodotus appealed to incentives, and the people he was trying to save lived. This is the narrow room. It is not wide. It is not comfortable. It does not let you stand with your head high and say the true thing and be heard, because the true thing is true. The narrow room does not work that way. But it exists, and there are specific ways to move inside it, and Thucydides, who had been on the receiving end of power, who had been exiled for a failure in the field, who understood from his own life what it meant to be without leverage, made sure to record it. The first thing is to understand what the narrow room is not. It is not hope. We have already spent some time with the word hope, with what the Athenians said about it, that it is danger's comforter, ruinous to those who have nothing in reserve, that it is the thing the cornered clutch when they should be assessing the terrain. Hope against evidence is not a strategy. Hope is a feeling, and sometimes a sustaining one, but it has no effect on the number of ships in the harbour. The Melians hoped. Their hope did not move a single oar, and it is not honour. The Athenians told the Melians directly, in terms that sound almost tender in their practicality, that there is no shame in yielding to the greatest city in the world when that city is offering you survivable terms. That the honourable thing, when the math is as clear as it was, is to be alive. That the city which chooses to die for pride is not braver than the city that survives, it is simply gone. Pride can be worn by the living. The dead have no use for it. So the narrow room begins with a single clear-eyed act, which is to separate what you can survive from what would flatter your pride. They are not the same question. A bad deal that lets you live is a different category of thing from a fatal stand that makes a statement. The Melians were offered something that was genuinely bad: subjection, tribute, the loss of their independence, but the city would have remained. the people would have lived, their children would have grown up on the island. The Athenians were not offering destruction, they were offering what every subject city in their empire lived under. It was demeaning. It was also survivable. The Melians chose the stand that felt honourable. The result was that there was no one left to feel the honour. The first move inside the narrow room, then, is this: when the strong party offers you something survivable, receive it. You can contest it later. You can work within it, outlast it, find the cracks in it, wait for the moment when the structure changes. But you cannot do any of those things if the choice you have made is to be erased. Survival is the prerequisite of everything else. The second move is to raise the cost. The powerful are not indifferent to cost. They are indifferent to your suffering. Often enough, there is no leverage in being the one who suffers more visibly, no advantage in the posture of the victim, in the absence of a referee who cares about victims. But they are not indifferent to their own expense. The siege of Melos dragged. It cost Athens ships and men and months. It was a small island, and it took longer than expected, and there was betrayal from within before it ended. The Melians, by resisting, raised the cost, not enough to save themselves, but they raised it. The question the powerless must always ask is not, am I strong enough to win, but am I capable of making this expensive enough that the calculus changes? A negotiation in which the other party has nothing to lose by crushing you and everything to gain ends one way. A negotiation in which the other party must pay something for each hour it takes, in reputation, in resources, in the distraction it creates, in the allies it might alienate, is a different negotiation. Not a fair one. Not one where justice is suddenly enforced, but one where the strong party's own arithmetic might point toward a deal that costs less than the fight. The third move is to control what information reaches the room. The Melians, remember, refused to let the Athenians address the popular assembly. They feared that a single persuasive speech might swing the crowd. This was a form of information management. They understood that an unmediated Athenian voice in their public space was a danger. The irony is that the information environment they controlled was the one inside the council chamber among men who had already decided to resist. They controlled the wrong room. They kept the Athenian argument away from the people who might have counselled surrender, while letting it run freely among those who amplified their own determination to fight. Information is not neutral. It flows toward the powerful unless someone directs it otherwise. The powerless have sometimes shaped the room by making the cost visible, not to the party doing the crushing, which already knows the cost and has accepted it, but to the parties watching. The third parties whose own interests might shift if they see too clearly what is happening. Athens had an audience, always the subjects watching, the allies calculating. The Athenians were obsessed with what their empire looked like to those observers. That obsession was a lever, small but real. And the fourth move, the Diodotus move, is to translate your argument into the language of the other party's interests. Not your interests, theirs, not what is right, what is useful to them. This is not a comfortable thing to say. It feels like a betrayal of something, to be told that the way to survive is not to say the true and necessary thing about justice and deserve to be heard, but to find the argument that makes the strong party's own self-interest point toward not destroying you. It feels like a kind of capitulation before the fight has even begun. But Diodotus was not capitulating. He was operating in the actual terrain rather than the terrain he wished existed. And the Mytileneans who lived, who grew up, who had children, who kept their lives. They lived because one man was willing to make the argument in the only language the room would receive. These are small rooms. Narrow, as I said. None of this is a formula for equality or for justice. The mechanism the Athenians named that justice exists only between parties who share a common authority capable of enforcing equal terms. That mechanism does not dissolve because you are clever or patient or strategic. It is the structure. What the narrow room offers is the possibility of surviving the structure long enough to see it change. And structures change. Power changes hands. The position that looks permanent rarely is. Which brings us to the men who read Thucydides and built their own architectures of thought on top of what he had written. In the year 1629, a young English scholar named Thomas Hobbes translated Thucydides into English. It was his first published work. He was not yet the Thomas Hobbes who would write Leviathan, who would describe the life of man without a sovereign authority as solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short, who would become the defining philosopher of the modern state. He was, in 1629, a man in his early 40s who had been working as a tutor, who was interested in history and in power and in what it meant to live in a world without reliable order. He chose Thucydides as his first project. And it is not difficult to see why, if you read carefully. Hobbes's central insight, the one that underlies Leviathan, the one that has shaped political philosophy for 4 centuries, is that in the absence of a sovereign, a common authority with the power to enforce agreements and protect rights, human life collapses into a competition where no one is safe and nothing is guaranteed. Without the sovereign, you are back to the condition the Athenians named at Melos. Justice is a question that only arises between parties with a common authority above them. Strip that authority away, and you have what Hobbes called the state of nature, and what modern political scientists call anarchy, not chaos in the everyday sense, but the technical meaning. No authority above the parties. Thucydides had described this. In the Melian dialogue, in the general logic of the war, in the collapse of civic life he detailed in the revolution at Corcyra, where the breakdown of shared norms turned neighbours into executioners. Hobbes read all of it and built a philosophy from the wreckage. The line from Melos to Leviathan is direct. If you want to understand why Hobbes believed so fiercely in the necessity of a sovereign, in the supreme importance of a power that stands above individual parties and enforces terms, you begin with what happens when that power does not exist. You begin with 30 men on one side of a room and 5 men on the other, and the Athenians saying, simply, that in the absence of a party above both of us that can compel fairness, the word fairness does nothing. Hobbes translated Thucydides because Thucydides had seen the thing Hobbes was trying to describe. And then Hobbes spent the rest of his working life trying to think through what it would mean to build something that stopped it from happening. In the 20th century, the dialogue was taken up again, this time by a school of thinkers who called themselves political realists. E. H. Carr, writing in the late 1930s, in the shadow of a Europe building toward catastrophe, argued that the defining failure of liberal international thought was its refusal to take power seriously. Its tendency to believe that goodwill and rational argument and international institutions could substitute for the cold arithmetic of force. Hans Morgenthau, writing in the years after the Second War, built a systematic theory of international relations on what he took to be the permanent features of political life: the will to power, the absence of a world government capable of enforcing law, the resulting inevitability that states act in their own interest, and that those interests, ultimately, come down to power. Both of them cited the Melian dialogue. Both of them saw in it a proof of the realist claim that beneath the language of justice and rights and international norms, the real determinant of outcomes is the distribution of power, and that those who pretend otherwise are not idealists, they are the kind of naive that gets people killed. This reading is not wrong. It is accurate as a reading of what the Athenians say. It is accurate as a reading of what happened to Melos. But there is another reading, and it is, in some ways, the more interesting one, because Thucydides was not Athens. Thucydides was the exiled general who had watched Athens from the outside for 20 years, who had interviewed both sides, who had written, in his own words, for someone who wants to understand clearly the events which happened in the past, and which, human nature being what it is, will at some point recur in similar or analogous forms. He wrote his book as a possession for all time, not as a victory anthem. A possession for all time is something you leave because you want future people to understand something, to be warned about something, to see something they might otherwise miss. And what he placed immediately after the cold sentence about Melos was not a triumph. It was a catastrophe. Book 6 opens with a description of Athens deciding to invade Sicily. The same city, the same leadership, fresh from the clean efficiency of Melos, looking out at the western Mediterranean and seeing another island, another opportunity, another demonstration of what the logic of power could achieve. The debate over Sicily, which Thucydides records in careful detail, has many of the same qualities as the Melian dialogue. The same confidence, the same dismissal of those who counselled caution, the same sense that the Athenians had mastered the terrain, understood the variables, and that the outcome was, in some way, already decided by the simple fact of their strength. Alcibiades spoke for the expedition. He was brilliant and charismatic and deeply, dangerously persuasive, and he wanted Sicily badly, wanted the glory of it, the territory of it, the demonstration of what Athenian power could accomplish when fully extended. Nicias, who had led the earlier raid on Melos years before, tried to dissuade them, laid out the risks carefully, described the distances and the unknowns, and then, attempting to make the cost of the expedition clear by describing how large a force would actually be needed, he accidentally made it sound so glorious that the assembly voted to give him even more ships and men than the plan had originally called for. They sailed in 415 BCE, the same year that Euripides, the Athenian playwright, staged a tragedy called The Trojan Women. Think about that for a moment. In the same season that the Athenian fleet departed for Sicily, in the same city, at the festival of Dionysus, a tragedy was performed that depicted the aftermath of the Greek destruction of Troy, the women of a conquered city, the children torn from them, the queen of a great civilization now a slave, the whole weight of what it means to erase a people rendered in verse and given to an audience who had, some of them, voted to do exactly that to Melos less than a year before. Euripides did not name Melos. He did not have to. His audience knew. Some Athenians, in other words, saw it, saw what their city had done, and felt the cost of it, and tried to hold it up to the light in the only form that might get past the defences, the old story, the distant war, the stage, the borrowed grief of women who were not Melian, but whose grief was the same. It did not stop the fleet. The Sicilian expedition, which lasted from 415 to 413 BCE, ended in the total destruction of the Athenian force, not a partial defeat. not a strategic setback from which the city recovered and returned. Total, what had been the greatest fleet and army Athens had ever sent beyond its own waters, was, over 2 years of miscalculation and misfortune and mounting disaster, entirely consumed. The survivors, those who were not killed in battle, were marched to the stone quarries of Syracuse, the Latomii, great open pits cut into the rock outside the city. And there they were kept, exposed to the sun, with minimal food and water, dying slowly, until almost none remained. Thucydides describes it in Book 7. He calls it the greatest Hellenic action of the war. He writes that the Athenians were destroyed with a total destruction. His language is measured, as always, but the weight of it is unmistakable. The city that had told Melos that the strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must had, within 2 years become the weak. The men in the quarries of Syracuse suffered what they must. Thucydides did not point this out. He did not write a paragraph explaining the irony or drawing the lesson. He did not need to. He placed the events in sequence and trusted his reader. This is the possession for all time, not a sermon, but a structure. The reader who reaches Syracuse, having just come from Melos, feels the weight of it in their own body. This is what Thucydides built. Not a realist manual, a trap for the confident reader. The scholars who argue about whether the Melian dialogue is a founding text of political realism or a tragedy exposing the self-destruction of a powerful city, they are both right, in a way. The realist reading is accurate. This is what power without a common authority looks like. This is the mechanism. This is the cold fact of it. And the tragic reading is also accurate. The same text shows what happens to those who believe that power exempts them from consequences, that the logic which licenses you to crush others is a logic that will always serve you. Thucydides knew both things. He had been inside both. He had been Athenian, and then he had been exiled, which is to say he had been powerful, and then he had been discarded. Which is to say he had lived both sides of the line that divides the strong from the weak. That experience, 20 years of it, travelling, interviewing, thinking in the long, uninterrupted space that only exile provides, is what made it possible for him to write a dialogue that works simultaneously as a demonstration of power and as a warning about it. The warning is this: power is a position, not a possession. It is a position you hold in a specific structure, at a specific moment, with a specific configuration of ships and alliances and resources and the goodwill of your own people. It is not a property of the entity that holds it. Athens was powerful in 416 BCE. Athens was destroyed in 404 BCE. The same city, a span of 12 years, and everything that had seemed permanent, the fleet, the empire, the tribute, the walls, the sense that Athenian power was simply a feature of the world, gone, the logic that the Athenians laid out at Melos, that power determines outcomes, that the strong rule where they can, that this is the natural law, does not include an exception clause for the city that is currently strong. The natural law applies to everyone, including you, including the empire that is, at this moment, writing its own name across the Aegean with the hulls of 30 ships. Alcibiades, who had been the great advocate of Athenian expansion, who had pushed for Sicily and argued for Melos, fled the city before the expedition reached its end. He was recalled to stand trial on a different matter, defected to Sparta, then to Persia, eventually returned to Athens, then fled again. He died in exile, killed by his enemies at last, a man who had embodied, in his own life, the complete instability of power without loyalty. He never stopped being brilliant. He simply kept being on the wrong side of whichever shift in the structure was happening at the moment. The structure is always shifting. This is the thing that the confident reader, the one who reaches the end of the Melian dialogue, feeling that the Athenians have named a permanent truth about the world, tends to underestimate. Yes, the mechanism is real. Yes, fairness without a shared enforcer is a wish. Yes, the strong will do what they can, and the weak will suffer what they must, and this has been true since before anyone wrote it down. But the strong become the weak. The position passes. The configuration of ships changes. The Delian League began as a voluntary alliance in 478 BCE. When Athens was the protector of smaller cities against Persia. By 454, they had moved the treasury to Athens itself, and the alliance was an empire. By 404, the empire was finished, from protector to oppressor to rubble in the span of a human lifetime. And the structure that the strong believe they have permanently settled, the peace they have imposed, the terms they have written, the colonists they have sent to islands whose populations they have erased, that structure is always someone else's unfinished grievance. It is always the thing that will, in some later generation, under some later configuration of force, be reopened. Melos itself was resettled, not immediately, not easily, but the Melian diaspora, the survivors, the enslaved who were eventually freed. They came back. The island was theirs again, in time. Not in the time of the men who were executed or the women who were sold, but in time. The long view is not a comfort to the people who are suffering in the moment. It never is. The mother who watched her children taken could not console herself with the knowledge that the Athenian Empire would be gone within a decade. That knowledge would have meant nothing to her. The only view available to the people inside the event is the close one, the immediate one. And within that view, the Athenians were correct. The strong did what they could, and the Melians suffered what they must. But Thucydides is writing for after. He is writing for the person reading decades or centuries or millennia later, who can see the whole arc, who can look at the Melos chapter and then look at the Syracuse chapter and feel the structure of what he built. And what he built is a warning that does not announce itself as a warning. It is a record. A cold, clear, stripped-down record of what happened when a city decided that power was the only real language and then forgot that the grammar of that language applied to everyone. The man who wrote the coldest truth about power had been thrown out by it. He knew from his own experience that the position passes, that the city which exiles you, which strips your title and your citizenship and sends you away from everything you built, is not a permanent fact of the universe. It is a contingent arrangement. And so he sat in his exile, in Thrace or Macedonia or wherever the long road took him, and he wrote for all time, which is to say he wrote for the moment after the arrangement has changed, and someone is trying to understand how it changed and what it means. Take a slow breath. Let the weight of all of that rest where it falls. You do not need to organize it. You do not need to draw the lesson and file it away. The night holds it. Somewhere, in an office or a home or a negotiation that feels impossibly uneven. Someone is making the mistake the Melians made, carrying the language of fairness into a room where there is no referee, hoping that naming the injustice will move the party with the power, believing that the strength of their argument is sufficient when the argument is in the wrong currency. And somewhere else, a Diodotus is quietly translating, finding the version of the argument that lands in the terms the room can receive. Not abandoning the truth, not pretending the injustice isn't there, but accepting the terrain as the terrain and moving through it with what the terrain actually allows. Both of those people are working from what Thucydides wrote. He is still useful after 2,400 years. He said he would be. He planned for it. He stripped the comforting stories away from history, the same way the Athenians stripped the comforting stories away from the negotiation. He said, "Look at the thing without the decorations, without the legend, without the prize essay written to please the audience, and see what it actually is." And what it actually is, at its root, is a record of human beings trying to navigate power, trying to hold it, trying to escape it, trying to name it honestly, trying to survive it, and failing, and sometimes succeeding, and always being subject to the same underlying conditions that make the whole question necessary in the first place. No common authority, no enforcer above the parties. The structure as it is, and within that structure, the narrow room. The Diodotus move, the separation of survival from pride, the raising of cost, the translation of your need into their language, and the long, patient understanding that the position passes. This is what he understood. Not that the strong will always win. They win until they don't. Not that justice is impossible. It is possible wherever a shared enforcer can hold the terms. Not that power is the only truth. It is the operating condition, not the final word. The final word, if there is one in Thucydides, is that human nature being what it is, these events will recur. Which is another way of saying, this knowledge is not decorative. It is the knowledge you will need, in one form or another, at some point in whatever life you are living. He gave it to you. He preserved it on purpose, in writing that was less pleasing to hear than the mythical and the legendary, stripped of the comfortable distortions, because he believed the clear version was worth more. A possession for all time means, I am handing you something that does not diminish with use. The Melian dialogue has been read for 24 centuries. It has not worn out. The question it contains, what happens between parties when no one stands above them to enforce the terms, is as immediate as it was in 416 BC. Because the condition it describes is the permanent human condition. The place where law runs out and the negotiation begins. Somewhere in you tonight there is a version of that question. Maybe it is large and structural and has the weight of something that has been building for a long time. Maybe it is small and personal and lives in a single room or a single relationship or a single arrangement that does not feel fair and has no referee to say so. Maybe it is both at once, the way things often are. Intimate and enormous, private and ancient. You are not alone in carrying it. The Melians carried it. Diodotus understood it. Thucydides spent 20 years of exile thinking about nothing else. Thomas Hobbes read about it at 40 and spent the rest of his life building a philosophy in response to it. Euripides put it on the stage for an Athenian audience that had, months before, voted to do the thing the stage was mourning. And 2 years later, Athens itself was in the quarries. The story is old enough to have room for all of it. And you have carried it through the night with some measure of care, following the thread of it from the first cold sentence to the ships off Syracuse, from the 5 Melian negotiators in their private room to the one man who stood up in the Athenian assembly and found the argument that worked. That is enough. You do not need to remember all of it. You do not need to carry the names or the dates or the sequence of events back with you into tomorrow. If something stayed, one image, one mechanism, one thing that landed differently than you expected, let that be enough. The rest will settle. where it settles, in whatever way understanding works when it travels through sleep. We have sat with the Melians in their council room. We have heard the Athenians strip away the comfortable language and lay the structure bare. We have watched Diodotus find the one argument that the room would receive. We have followed the fleet to Sicily, to the quarries, to the cold sentence in Book 7 that says they were destroyed with a total destruction. We have walked the line from Thucydides in exile to Hobbes at his desk to Euripides on the stage, the long relay of people trying to understand the same permanent condition and pass what they understood forward. We have been here, together, in the quiet. And the Melian dialogue, 2,400 years old, stripped of its legend, as clear as the night you are in. It will be here in the morning, too. It will be here whenever you need it. Because it is, as he said it would be, a possession for all time. Sleep well now. One last sleepy beep before the dark. Good night.